Once again, here we are in Central Oregon, if you recall from a month ago. And we had lots of generations of land. This is our ranch started in the 1890s. This is my grandfather, and this is him over here, my grandfather, grandmother, aunt, uncle of my father. So the last time when we were here, we were talking about some controlled burns. We did those in 2009, 10, and 11. And after the controlled burns, then we went back in, painted our monitoring posts if they needed to be, and started monitoring to what it was that we burnt and what it was we didn't burn. And so we tried to keep a track of those. This was we looked at the north, east, west, and south. We came back in 2013 for the burn we did in 2011. See what, just, what's recovering, what's actually dying, and some of these trees take a while for them to die, and then to see what kind of recovery is happening.
But I'm going to ask John to back up for a second to the very first monitoring picture. I'd like you to meet Bonnie and Kip. Bonnie is the black and white dog. Kippy is a little dark heeler down there. When we were working in heavy grass, it was always good to be able to be behind Kippy, because he could always find his way through all the twigs and the snags. He was a wonderful, wonderful director.
So we did the same kind of monitoring, looking a bit, and then we would could compare those photos. We did a lot of other projects. This was a washout in 1995, and it took a while before we could get back and find a culvert or pay for a culvert, and some friends that had some big equipment to be able to put it back. SWCD helped engineer it so that it would actually work once it was put in. It took it's not easy to put in a culvert that will last and make it work. Here it is in the finished condition, and then a couple of years later, after it's seeded in, and when we talked about our logging program, we sent lots of loads of logs over this culvert. Another program that sometimes you go with the flow, as NRCS was working with trying to get aspen regenerated, and so we had some derelict aspen stands, and we got a grant to come back, fence those off, all the grazing critters that we could fence it for: elk, deer, antelope, and especially cattle. And here's the fences. Here's a fence around this little aspen stand, another aspen stand with a fence around it. Here's one of the later ones. Instead of using the high tensile fencing, which is much more expensive, use this plastic netting. It was built for fish farming in the Puget Sound. Is where it developed, and it works pretty good. It's not the best part, but.
And one time when we were driving on the road and inspecting this aspen stand with the fence, we were riding with Andy Gallagher, who's with our SWCD, and some of you may know Andy. So John and Andy are very carefully watching. John's watching the road carefully, and Andy is watching the aspen and the fencing. And I'm sitting in between them, and all of a sudden I say, guys, there's a cougar family right down there in front of us. And indeed, there was a mother cougar and at least 2 kittens, as I recall.
Yeah.
Andy Gallagher happened to have a good friend who was a good cougar hunter. So he came out and took care of that for us. That was pretty exciting.
We got a grant to help pay for this well and a solar pump. So we got the well in. So when we did this in 2013, the well costs about $10,000, and the pump and the solar program cost another $10,000, and we got about half that paid for. We bought a unfortunately, we bought a used storage tank, and when we got it in, we discovered there was a hole in it, and the only person to fit down was Barbara Jane, who is the wife of Tyler, is holding his wife's hand, and
they survived this. This was in 2014. And everybody wondered, oops, what's Barbara Jane going to say now? But by now they have twin baby girls and a little boy. So she hung in there, but it took a real effort to get her out. She had the cable tied around her waist, and you see the cable is attached to the caterpillar back there. And that's Tyler's father sitting in the cat, lifting her out while Tyler tries to pull her out. It was an interesting day, to say
Yeah.
the least.
all OSHA approved, of course.
Right.
And then piping it to the a big water trough. That's one of the mining tires that come from Nevada. There's a company in Burns that cuts those tires in half so that we can use them. They cost about $900. They're about 11 feet or so across. They're pretty good, pretty efficient, but it takes a lot of work to put it in, get it level, and then get all the piping in. The wife is almost forgiving husband. So getting it level, getting it set, getting all the pipe in and a bunch of dirt in there packed in. Notice the T-post in there. And then 21 sacks of Saccharine later, we start filling it and slowly getting it to settle in and seal.
We want to start introducing you to some of the other people too. Tyler and Barbara Jane, whom you just saw with the big tank and being pulled out with the caterpillar, are nephew, cousins. And this is Holly, who is the sister of Tyler. So this is the next generation that's going to be in charge of the ranch. And so John is the, fifth generation? No, fourth generation, I guess, aren't
Yep,
you? Yeah.
fourth.
And so Tyler and Barbara Jane and Holly and Ryan are the sixth generation. So the ranch has been around and it's going to stay in the family for a long time.
Hopefully. And once again, there's getting more settled, getting a fence around it so that we can, this tank will serve 3 different pastures.
And the wire, the old tires have a lot of wire in them. And so my job was to go around and snip off all the wire around the top edges so that the little calves, when they come into water, don't get caught on the wire. And we did that pretty well.
And for the T-posts and held this pipe up. This was a micrometer system, which sends a pressure system for how much pressure the water's putting down on the probe. It sends a satellite so up to the satellite in the sky, and then that sends to Cupertino, California, and then they send it to the Dalles, Oregon for reinterpretation. So they change pressure to feet of water, so we know how many feet of water is in that tank. It does that 4 times a day, and then they send it to our computer, and then the kids and put it on their smartphones so they can check to make sure that there's water without having to actually see it. And here's the finished product. You can see the micrometer and the cows and watering in this pasture. So we can water 3 different pastures here. Here's another trough system. This one's aluminum. It's made up in Omak, Washington. You can't buy it from them. You have to buy it retail, but it's about maybe $500 more than the rubber tanks, but it's a lot simpler to put in. Once again, the micrometer then moves where the cows move. And here's another one, and here's 7th generation helping put in this water trough. Very simple to do.
So again, you're seeing Holly, who is the sixth generation sitting on the edge of the trough. Her husband is on the far left, as you see it, Ryan Kingsbury. And then Cassidy is their little gal. And she's already really good on horses. This picture was a few years ago, and she's mastering the ranching business.
Yeah, in the first grade now.
Yeah.
So this is another project. We did this project with the Deschutes Land Trust, which is a program where they were going to rehabilitate the land at the Crooked River, where a couple of creeks, Mackay Creek and Ochoco Creek, come into the Crooked River, and the Crooked River then goes into Lake Setustus, and that flows down into the Deschutes. So they're trying to rehabilitate so that fish can migrate all the way from the ocean up to Prineville. So 1,500 of these trees went to that program.
And they lumbered through, you can imagine these trees going through downtown Prineville. And Steve Gillen, who owns the truck and who we've known him since he was in high school. So it's really exciting to be working with him. But he was wondering, how are the ODOT people and the police going to handle my truck and the trees going through town? Well, the Oregon Department of Transportation guys saw him, laughed at him, and waved him on.
So 50 truckloads of trees going through. This is our latest program of juniper and forest rehabilitation. This is a bobcat, and we have a mulch on that. Look at the big teeth on here. This thing runs about 22 to 2,300 RPMs, and when it catches the branches or the trees, it just destroys them. It's kind of fun to watch juniper trees turn into mulch and blast off. It can throw things a long ways. So this is excuse me. This is where we cut the trees, limb them up, and we've been taking the bolts out and then using the bobcat with the mulcher. Well, this is the slow mulcher. And notice one of the things that we learned about juniper removal is that you need loppers.
And you cannot leave any green whatsoever when you trim them. You've got to get every piece of green. If you even leave a pinhead size of green at the bottom, that will take off. Some of the very early research on juniper was done on our place by Lee Edelman, and he didn't know that when he first started the research. But when we came back to the ranch in '87, we looked at the area that he had used for his research plot. And I won't say what kinds of names we called him, but every tree that we had to cut had at least 12 stems coming up from the bottom. They were awful, but he didn't know that was going to happen, and we didn't either. And it's always a learning. There's always something to learn when you're out there.
So, oops, see this kind of stand, what it looks like. This is what it looks like when you get the mulcher and you get going on it. And we've taken out the boles and the big trees, but you can make things look pretty yeah, you can get it back to where it might have looked like when before the first pioneers comes. So these are some of the trees that we took off of that ground. You can see they were growing well, and there was lots of trees there, and the better trees were then we brought a guy who came out with a sawmill. This is a young man. This is a pretty fancy mill. These wood misers. This one's probably an $80,000, $90,000 mill, and he was taking all the better logs, the bigger logs, the ones that didn't have rot in them, and cutting them up into different kinds of boards, bigger cans or boards, and then taking them they were sent to Portland. There's a nonprofit called Sustainable Northwest who can't get enough juniper lumber in their mill yard in Portland.
Well, one thing about this young man, Ryan, he was working for a utility company, helping maintain stream sides and riparian areas. And he was cutting all the trees out. And he kept thinking, there's got to be something to do with these trees. We can't just leave them there. And that's what prompted him to get his own sawmill. And he is doing very well. He works hard, has one employee, and we do everything we can to encourage him.
You can see the wood is look really well. The lumber goes for landscaping. It takes the place of railroad ties in landscaping. Without that, the vineyards use this wood for their stakes in their vineyards, because they don't have to treat the wood, and they can be quote green and sustainable that way. But yeah, this wood, there's a great market for it. And then other people have sawmills, and they'll buy some logs. These logs were larger pine logs that in our 4-year, we've had about a 4-year drought, and we're losing a lot of our pine market because, as I said, we can't manage our pine forests because of there's no markets that are viable.
I think these guys. On the left is John Buckhouse, on the right is Tim DeBoot, and of course John is in the middle. Anytime we do a workshop, which we do a lot of them, these two guys are often with us. And John was actually the first one that got us going on this. He started bringing OSU students to our place in 1989. We came back to the ranch in 87. And in 89, John started bringing OSU range students over. It's been really fun to keep track of some of them through the years.
Yeah. To notice that these guys always can get the group in the palm of their hands. It was always neat that people can listen to them, and they're a wealth of information. Notice here's juniper trees in the background. You can see where they've been limbed up. Eventually they'll be into some market.
This particular group of people there are about 12 people in the group. You don't see all of them here, but they're a program that we call the Oregon Master Naturalist Program. It's an OSU project. And so people from the city and the country, but primarily from the city, come out to participate and learn about the land and try to get an understanding of what's happening with the land, why it's happening. And so the Master Naturalist Program that we have in Central Oregon incorporates range, forests, geology, wildlife, restoration, and I think that's it. But here you see Tim and John Buckhouse leading this particular discussion. The fun thing about, really a delightful thing that happened this last year, several people were here from Portland. At the end of the first day, which was on our ranch, one of the ladies from Portland came up to me and said, "Now I finally understand why we have this urban-rural divide. I want to help do something about it."
Once again, you can see John keeping everybody in the palm of his hand as people are very interested in the kinds of things he has to say. We also bring other folks. This is Oregon Fish and Wildlife and NRCS. Jenny Moffett is NRCS Soils. And we have a class out. This is before juniper cutting and looking at the grasses and wildlife and the inevitable soils pit. This is a retired Forest Service geologist, and this is a semi-retired Forest Service soil scientist, and it's such a neat thing to be able to call on people that have this expertise in showing students, just what's going on in there. Here's another program we had. This is a retired NRCS soil scientist, and he's leading. This is Oregon soil scientists of their annual meeting, and they had it on our ranch. We have a humongous soil pit.
And it was snowing and raining, and they came by bus. And John had very carefully prepared a place for the bus to go so that it wouldn't get stuck. But the bus driver thought he knew better. And he took his own plan, and guess what? The bus became incredibly stuck. But 60 soil scientists, all working together, were able to push the bus out and get him back on the right road.
They got back at him because I don't know if you've ever watched students work with soil and put it in their fingers and roll it around. Well, if you get soil scientists to do that, they grab great gobs of stuff. And so when they all got back on the bus with very muddy feet and very dirty hands.
And they got even with the bus driver.
They did. You can tell we have really heavy clay in some of our areas.
And this is for 13 years, we did a work weekend, bringing people from the city and local people together. We called it Nan's Weekend. Nan was an extension agent in Deschutes County, and she died very unexpectedly, very young. And in the process of grieving over Nan, we got to know her parents and her siblings. So we started the Nan's Weekend at Dixie Meadow, bringing people together, often had as many as 60 or 70 people. And the rules for the weekend were Nan's rules: meet together, have an open mind, look at the whole, ask questions, share, learn, and have fun. And we did some incredible special times with bringing these people together. And some of them were professionals, some of them were just people that we haven't gone to who knows where. But this was a 1 mile fence that they built. Most of them had never done anything like this, but everybody jumped in and helped build that fence to create one of our pastures.
It was really difficult because you had to have a project that 40 to 50 people could do in a day, and then get everything set up so that they would work on that.
Some of you know Teal Purrington. Teal was with BLM for several years. Teal is in the black sweater here in front of us. And then behind her is Phil Chang. And Phil is now a county commissioner in Deschutes County. But this was a project with Teal, who had a better handle on how to put the fence together, was teaching Phil, and we can't remember who this girl is, but it was part of the work project. And then we gather always to have a meal together and talk time. And in this picture, you're going to see Hugh Barrett, John find Hugh. And if you all know Hugh, Hugh's the guy that taught us about capture, store, and safely release the water. I think this is Craig Obermiller standing up here in the middle. There's Craig. And down here is Nick Vora. Nick was a little bit younger back in those days, and he was our PNW SRM president a couple of years ago. But he was just kind of getting started in the world when this picture was taken.
Here's Pilot Butte. You can see juniper cuts here and here and all over. Plenty of juniper cuts. Once again, our pasture management was to kind of, if you remember right, in the 1890s when they set the ranch up, and it was brought together with different all kinds of different homesteads that were made up this ranch. It wasn't really set up for grazing, so trying to break the pastures up so that we could graze them, and so that we wouldn't have to come to the same pasture every year at the same time and give the pastures rest. It wasn't so much worrying too much about how much was grazed, but get a good impact on the grazing, and then move them off, and so that that pasture can rest and regrow, and be able to move these cattle early in the season when the grass is growing, slow them down later on as the season goes along and the grasses have matured out. A lot of things that we've done have to do with projects, long range projects. This was a survey that we did early on. I think this about 1989, 1990. This was Dixie Meadow. The very first picture we showed you was up here where we were standing at the homestead. And notice the head cuts across here and all of this erosion, and you can see it's going to go all the way up the meadow. One of the things that I learned from Lee Edelman and very beginning, when we first came back to the ranch and they were still doing some research at the ranch, we were standing way up high on the uplands, and Lee asked me, well, what are you going to do? And I says, well, I'm going to go down and fix the cricks and all the riparian areas. And he says, well, maybe you ought to rethink that, and maybe you ought to go back to and work on the uplands first. And so there was a BLM range con that I won't mention, that said, well, nobody's ever going to do that, which, then that set my jaw, and I said, okay, we're going to work on the uplands first. And so it wasn't, and here it is in 2011, we finally were able to come back. So we got a grant using large equipment and rock. So this is the step pools that they're putting in. You see the big rock, and you had to place each one of those rocks. And you look at that early head cuts, and so we worked on all those head cuts, rocking them in and being very careful to make sure that we were doing this right and it wouldn't work. A young woman from SWCD was a project manager, and she was directing it. You can see it was early or late fall. We were putting this all together.
And some of you may know Libby Stahansik. That was who that was, if you happen to know Libby.
So here again, we've got all this rock across here, back over, and these step pools coming down. And then you can see the runoff from that first year as it's coming bit. This was the big test to see whether it would hold. And then in 2012, after in the fall, what we grew and how did it work? You can still see the trees that are marking the area. Back that next year, we had some pretty good water flows coming down. By 2014, here's Libby. She's a little bit smiling a little better weather. It's in March, and the runoffs come along pretty good. You can see the step pools coming down and how that rock is held together, and the water slowed down, and it's no longer is it cutting all across here and here. By 2016, you can see that it's what in Libby would have been standing about here, and the water is coming across here, and you can see this is not a beaver. That's a dog. And then in 2017, after we grazed that, then you can see the water. You can see the willows starting to come back. In 2018. All this across here, you wouldn't even know that there was head cuts across here. It's and you can see where the channel is, and you can see some of the rock back. And then after grazing, and then the spring of 2021, you can see how these step pools are still holding in and have held their ground. You can see the snow up in the uplands coming down. 2021, it's see in this March and after it had a chance to grow that season, it's really grown in. 2021, and then here it is this spring.
And just a reminder, if you remember the first time we met by Zoom, we were telling you about the early settlers in Dixie Meadow, and they were the family from Kentucky, and they were the ones that we believe probably were actually doing rotational grazing based on the types of fencing that we kept finding underneath the ground when we came back to the ranch. So rotational grazing was not something that you did in the early 1900s, but we think that these folks from Kentucky were actually already doing it.
Just interesting, the cattle come in when we were logging, we didn't have chance to, but we found that you couldn't run cows and be a full-time logging. You couldn't be there at 4 o'clock on the landing in the morning and then run cows. It just didn't work. So we sold our cows, our cousins, and brought their cattle in, and then we have it worked out on the gain of the calves for what our payment is. So their idea is to move cows slowly, get the idea that if the cow decides that that's where she wants to go, and you can encourage her to go, then you can move cattle a whole lot easier than if you try to work them hard. And if you work cows slow and easy, they're easier to work with. And once again, actually, once in a while they get on horses, but most of the time they use motorbikes and ATVs. That's a new modern cowboy way. Notice, move the cows slow and easy. Look, these trees here, notice this hillside, you can see these trees up here, the pine trees in the middle, and then this is what it looks like in the same picture across the hillside, and this is what it looks like today versus all those trees. The 1,500 trees went to riparian creek fish habitat, and then the rest of them were cut to either firewood or saw logs.
So these were all junipers.
Yep. Once again, our pasture management, we put in for several years, we put in these New Zealand high tensile fences, and then notice that the cows, it's really good for antelope, deer, and elk, but you've got to electrify them for cows. And calves do their thing. They never stay within where their boundaries are, but if their mamas are over here, they'll come back. So, but you got to electrify those New Zealand fences. But if we get intensive grazing and then move the cows and get them all over to the next pasture, we're finding that works best. Once again, cow-calf program. We've gone more to a yearling calf. We found that if these cows are over here in their third trimester before they give birth and they get into our pine trees, they get that pine needle abortion. They can get it with junipers too, but some cows just get addicted in the wintertime for gnawing on pine needles.
And this is my favorite picture. Can you see the sign that says park here? Well, guess who's parked there?
Yeah. We had another program we'll talk about in a second, but these cows are pretty smart. So we have we're working for lots of wildlife. These are mountain quail. We don't see too many mountain quail, but I think a lot of our juniper work has helped them. It gives them lots of cover and ways to go. This ground, we've got another grant with that was called the Two Chiefs grant with the Forest Service and the NRCS and for private land. And we're going to pile all these trees and essentially we won't be able to use them much, but we'll pile them up, get them burnt, get reseeding, and then work on our pasture management. But notice right behind the watering trough, this is spring development. We did working. These are not the big troughs, but we call them skidder tires, and we've got a lot of those out at spring developments with their construction tires. And then notice the little rabbit here and the coyote going after it. We also have other critters. We tend to leave these guys alone. I found that probably more people get hurt trying to kill them than just leave them alone.
And then we initially had about 200 bird boxes, bluebird boxes. A fellow who was retired and liked to do woodworking made those for us. And one Nan's weekend, one of our very early Nan's weekend, one of the projects was to get those all up. And so that crew put 200 bluebird boxes up throughout our forest. Now the challenge is to find all of those boxes every year and clean them every year. That is truly a challenge, but here you can see one that's been opened up and John can clean it out. Some of the bluebird boxes are no longer bluebird boxes. They're woodpecker boxes. Whoever else has decided to do a little remodeling of the house. So there's a variety of birds that use these.
So we put blocks in there to help them out, give them a fresh start. Tried a lot of wrens, a lot of bluebirds, a lot of little dicky birds use them. It's kind of an important part of our world. We do some hunting. These are pretty laid back hunters, but we've done quite a bit of elk and deer hunting on our place. And
I want to tell them a little bit about these two guys. When I see some of you in person, be sure to ask me about the fellow on the left with the red shirt. This is a city kid. He grew up in Portland. He went to Oregon State. He studied journalism, ended up in my hometown, Ontario, working for the radio station. And one of his early trips out to report on a fire, he made a name for himself. And I won't go into all those details, but he has never been able to live that down. The other fellow is Dick Cook. And when we went to Huntington, John was going to be teaching in Huntington, which is a population of 500 on a big year. We thought, well, we'll stay 1 year and then we're out of here. But Dick Cook and his family made us part of their family. And we stayed there for 10 years. And even though we always knew we'd be coming back to the ranch, we didn't really have a timeline for it until one day, again, we were still in Huntington. We got a phone call from a bank in Prineville where John's mom was banking. They called us to say, you need to know that Nellie just drove her car down the sidewalk. So we took a little earlier leave from Huntington. We intended to, and came back, and we've been here since.
And Denny is also he was a press secretary for Governor Achia.
Yeah.
So got some age on us. Some of the other hunters are a little more into it. Got all the paraphernalia and they go after it. Some nice deer. We have a few elk and antelope that have also been taken. We did this program. This was with the Oregon Fish and Wildlife. It was called Access and Habitat. And this was hunting by permission. We figured on our ranch it was better if a small party had a couple of days all to themselves to hunt, so that they were not, they had a more quality hunt. We allowed, essentially we did this twice. So a 3-year period, we allowed public hunting on our place. They do more of it in Eastern Oregon where they have hunting. The Fish and Wildlife pays through some government grants and hunting access grants. They pay landowners to allow hunting on their ranches, and we were able to secure enough money from this program to essentially go clear around the ranch. We put in 16 miles of we rebuilt all the exterior fencing for around the ranch. It had deteriorated. Some of it was 100 years old, with a lot of elk and feral horse pressure. They're pretty well beat down, but now we've got them fenced up, and some interior fences were rebuilt too. We always like all kinds of.
That's one of our favorite pictures. How often do you get to see a mom and her babe like this?
We have antelope, elk. Here's once again, we did a project, and you can see the step pools down where we're trying to keep the erosion down. But lots of projects. We have lots of shed hunters, which are probably the bane of my life, because they have they tend to be kind of rogue. They don't respect private property much, and they'll cut fences or do whatever they want to do. We found them that they with the cell phones, they can now they can be let off, and it's really hard to find them. They look like Rambos going through the woods. Once in a while you see somebody with all the camo gear in the world, a backpack full of sheds. So with that, we have time for questions.
I've muted everyone's mic, so feel free to unmute your mic and fire away and then John. So John, I'll ask you about your high tensile fence. I noticed that most of that was on with metal T-posts. You have trouble with it shorting out?
Let's see. What was the question again?
Well, I was curious about your high tensile fence being built with metal posts. Do you have trouble with cattle knocking it off the post and the fence shorting out?
Boy,
volume
not
still
understanding.
good?
Metal post.
Yeah, are you using metal posts on your high tensile fence?
Metal post.
Sorry, I'm
Yeah,
gonna change my
we
audio.
always, yeah, the metal posts are for the, I still, I don't understand the question, so.
We really can't hear you, Tom.
Okay, I'm gonna change my audio settings and I'll open the floor to anyone else to ask questions.
Well, while you're doing that, I do have a few things to say about people that, and there's been an awful lot of people that have helped us. And I think that Lee Edelman, who was a professor at Oregon State, he's been retired for several years, but like I said, things that we learned from Lee was that you can't fix the riparian areas until you fix the uplands, and you got to make the uplands function before you can fix the streams. The other thing I can remember from Lee was that many students don't read or think enough about rangeland to have a passing grade, and I tell you, being a rancher, our tuition for a lot of these guys is a lot higher, and the grades are a lot harder. Rick Miller was another one of our heroes, and one thing I remember about Rick says that once you get to where you're going to go and work, stop and do nothing but observe for 10 to 15 minutes or 20 minutes. Think about what is there and what's going on before you start working. And for a rancher, that's really, really, really hard to do, and for a logger, because you want to get going and burning daylight, as it were. But to stop and just think about what's going to happen and what you're going to do. And I think Rick was saying, well, before you screw things up, think about it before you do something. And I think Tony Secar and Roger Sheila, those guys are two. They said that rangeland cycling are constantly changing. So when I think about what our grandparents saw, it was not the same rangelands that we're going to pass on to the next generations. They're different, and we ought to recognize that. I mean, a lot of people go out and they're like, well, forests change, but rangelands change too, and people don't really relate to that. They look out there, well, it's a big sagebrush ground, nothing's on it, but it's really it's something to really think about. And I think John Buckhouse is John Buckhouse, another hero. But one of the things I remember about always John was that in complex rangelands or natural resource problems, the first simple, straightforward, logical solution that is proposed is always wrong. And I think that we get that an awful lot, you know, somebody says, oh yeah, no, this is it. You know, especially when you get, you know, controversial things and you get a lot of, you know, our environmental friends come up with all these things. And of course, you get it from almost every professor out down there you've ever met, is that you know, we don't change the questions on the test, we just change the answers. And that means that the world's changing, and the rate of change is faster and faster. And I think about, you know, what my grandparents and my dad and my uncle, you know, the kinds of things that they went through is that rate of, you know, their rate of change wasn't as fast as our rate of change. And so we're trying to respond to a lot of outside pressures to make the ranch what this or that or the other thing. And you got to kind of hold your course, but it's difficult when you got changes. I mean, Lynn's grandmother went to college, and they got a picture of her going to college in a horse and in a buggy, you know, and yet she lived over 100, and she saw, you know, men landing on the moon. And that's kind of I mean, that's a lot of change, but the change that we've had since the first man on the moon. I mean, the cell phones that we have on the ranch have more computing power than when they did to go to the moon. And I don't, you know, I was thinking about my great grandfather. What would he think about, you know, wandering around on a ranch to be able to take a picture and send it anywhere in the world? And you know, it'd be like, you know, that'd be something magical. You know, they couldn't comprehend that. They're coming out of the Civil War. The other thing I think about, you know, Thames and Stringham, I don't know if anybody remember Tamsin, but she, you know, she was always pretty practical. She says, you know, learn the damn grasses and forbs on your ranch. You know, how hard can that be? And, well, it's not hard, but you got to apply yourself a little bit. And of course, Hugh Barrett, you know, you have to learn how to dig a soil pit, and then read it, and then you gotta really practice this, you know, capture, store, and safe release stuff. And it's easy to trip off your fingers and your tongue is, oh, we'll get a capture, store, and safe release that, and then make it happen on the ranch is not quite as fast and easy as you think it might be. Anyway, those are kind of some thoughts. There's an awful lot of people I haven't mentioned, but they've been a great help to us. Tim DeBoot, you know, saved our tail a whole lot of times just by saying something simple. So anybody have any more questions? We'd
Did
be
we
glad to.
understand that first question, Tom? Can we hear your voice yet?
I don't know, can
Oh,
you?
yes. Yep, we can hear you.
Okay, good. Well, I apologize for that. Any other questions or comments?
Well, we either really bombed or we really wowed them.
I
just-
have one comment. First, I'd like to say thank you to John and Lynn for sharing all that you did and sharing your time with me when you didn't, and I was able to do that. My comment is that you ranchers have the most difficult task of trying to figure out the practical ways to put the knowledge that we are constantly learning and gaining into practice in a way that makes sense and is workable. So thank you for doing what you do.
Thanks, I appreciate that. It's good to have you out there looking at grasses and helping us understand.
And I thank you, and I thoroughly enjoyed it.
Well,
And
we're
if my
all-
memory was any good, I'd remember a whole lot more of what I learned.
I was going to say, you're all welcome to come anytime. We have 40 pairs of loppers, small loppers, so that everybody gets to help cut baby junipers.
Well, I have a comment that I just want to say thank you for showing all of your years of hard work. I was on your place way back when in the 2008-9 with John Buckhouse and Hugh Barrett and Rick Miller and all those folk. And and then I remember when Tim DeBoot was working with you, and I remember when you called John and told him that you had water in your basement because you were eradicating junipers. And I just love you both. And I've watched what you've been doing all these years, even though you haven't heard from me. I'm watching from afar and just really appreciating all of the good and great work that you are doing in the rangelands, and can't thank you enough for conversations like this where we get to catch up and see how things are moving along.
Well, thank you.
Anyone else? Well, I'll remind you that this presentation, as well as the first half of today's presentation, will be the first half is posted on YouTube. Just search for Washington Chapter Society for Range Management. You'll see the playlist, not only of John and Lynne's presentation, but other quarterly presentations that we've hosted. And I'll get this one posted within the next few days. You can find a link to that YouTube site on the pnwsrm.org website as well. John and Lynne, I know you spent a lot of time organizing your photos and practicing and reorganizing to make this presentation. Today was a wonderful conclusion for what you started last month. And I can't thank you enough for sharing your ranch and your insight with us today.
Well, thanks, Tom, for helping us
Guiding us.
through this friggin' computer. So, and we got, a lot of pictures that we wanted to show, but we tried to up our game from the first time and not do so many ands, uhs, and buts before on this one.
We'll pick that up for the 10-year follow-up, John. Thank you, everyone, for joining us.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thanks for everybody.
Yeah, thank you.